There's a particular kind of wound that doesn't bleed immediately. You walk away from the conversation feeling warm, seen even. You told them about the year that broke you, the relationship that rewired you, the fear you've never quite named out loud. They nodded at the right moments. They offered their own story, painful, credible, perfectly timed. You thought, this is rare. You thought, this is real. And then, much later, in some unremarkable moment, a group conversation, a decision that needed defending, a moment when loyalty had a cost, you understood what had actually happened. You weren't building a friendship. You were being inventoried. Machiavelli would not have been surprised. The man who refused to be comfortable. Niccolò Machiavelli was not a cynic. Cynics are disappointed idealists, people who expected better and are now performing their disappointment. Machiavelli was something colder and more useful, an empiricist of human nature. He watched what people actually did, not what they said they valued, not what they believed about themselves, not what they wished were true. His conclusion was uncomfortable, and it remains uncomfortable, which is probably why people keep reaching for his books 5 centuries after his death. He wrote that men are ungrateful, fickle, deceptive, cowardly, and greedy. Not some men. Not men under unusual circumstances. Men, meaning people, operating according to their nature when their interests are genuinely at stake. This is the sentence that loses him readers. It feels like a verdict on humanity. But read it more carefully. He's not saying people are evil. He's saying people are self-interested, and that assuming otherwise is not generosity. It's negligence. The knife is never visible from the front. That's not a metaphor about dramatic betrayal. It's an observation about architecture. People who intend to harm you do not announce themselves. They earn proximity first. And proximity requires trust. And trust is built through warmth, vulnerability, shared laughter, confided fears. The process of being betrayed is, almost always, indistinguishable from the process of being loved, right up until the moment it isn't. This is not a reason to close yourself off. It is a reason to pay attention. 3 masks, worn casually. There are patterns in how people who mean you harm present themselves, not because they've read a manual, because these patterns work. They've been refined over lifetimes, sometimes consciously, often not, because human psychology has predictable openings, and certain behaviors exploit those openings reliably. The first is accelerated intimacy. Someone meets you, and within hours, sometimes, within a single conversation, they're sharing things that take most people years to say aloud. A violent past, a pattern of betrayal by people who were supposed to protect them, a wound they've never shown anyone else. Your nervous system responds to this the way it's designed to, with reciprocity. They trusted you with something real. The socially appropriate response is to trust them back. So you do, and now they know things about you that they didn't earn the right to know. Machiavelli understood reciprocity as a structural force, not a feeling. When someone gives you something, a confession, a secret, a display of vulnerability, it creates an obligation you didn't choose. The gift precedes the debt. The smart manipulator knows this. They lead with disclosure, not because they trust you, but because they want you to trust them. Or more precisely, they want you to behave as if you trust them, which is operationally identical. Real intimacy is slow. It's built not through monologues about trauma, but through accumulated evidence. Small moments of consistency, decisions that cost something, presence during inconvenient times. When someone is rushing you toward closeness, ask what they would lose if you slowed down. The answer tells you everything. Test it simply. Say no to something minor, not with explanation, not with apology, just no. Watch what happens in the 3 seconds after. Genuine care shows up as acceptance, maybe curiosity. The need for control shows up as pressure, guilt, or a coldness that wasn't there before. You are not being difficult. You are reading the instrument. The second is strategic neutrality. You've been treated badly, not ambiguously, clearly, visibly, in front of witnesses. And someone you considered a friend says, "I just don't want to take sides. I can see both perspectives. I try to stay out of these things." It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like emotional maturity. It is neither. In The Prince, Machiavelli is explicit. Neutrality in someone else's conflict earns the contempt of both parties. A prince who refuses to declare himself gains nothing and risks everything. But we're not talking about princes. We're talking about your friend, in the specific moment when you needed them to say that was wrong, and they chose instead to preserve their access to everyone in the room. Neutrality is a position. It has consequences. When someone refuses to stand with you on something clear, not complicated, not genuinely ambiguous, actually clear, they are making a calculation. They are deciding that your pain is less valuable than their social comfort. They are choosing to keep doors open that loyalty would require closing. An open enemy is useful. You know where they stand. A neutral friend is a fog. They will seem supportive in easy times and dissolve in hard ones. They will not defend you when you're not present. They will not pay the social price that real loyalty sometimes demands. Ask them directly, "What's your position on this?" Don't soften the question. Watch whether they answer it or redirect it. The redirect is the answer. The third is performed virtue. "I hate drama," said by someone who creates it constantly. "I'm brutally honest." Said by someone who uses honesty as a weapon and calls the damage candor. "I'm just a good person." Said unprompted, to no one in particular, as if the declaration itself settles the question. Psychology has a name for this: reaction formation. We perform the opposite of what we fear we are. The person loudest about their integrity is often managing a quiet terror that they have none. The person who narrates their own generosity is frequently keeping score. The person who preaches against manipulation is, in many cases, describing themselves with great accuracy, just in the third person and with the moral polarity reversed. Machiavelli wrote that appearing virtuous is often more useful than being virtuous. Modern life has produced people who've internalized this so completely that they believe their performance. They're not lying to you about their goodness. They're lying to themselves and inviting you to co-sign the fiction. Watch behavior in moments when the performance has no audience. Watch how they treat people who can't help them. Watch what they do when no one is recording. Watch what happens when you withdraw your approval, quietly, without announcement. If the warmth that seemed genuine disappears when the applause does, you were watching a show. Why you didn't see it. There's a cognitive pattern called the normalcy bias. In conditions of genuine threat, the mind defaults to interpreting ambiguous signals as safe. This is not stupidity. It's an energy conservation strategy that worked reasonably well for most of human history, where genuine threats were rarer and more obvious than they are now. But it means that when someone close to you is slowly repositioning themselves to use you, your mind is actively working against your own perception. Every red flag gets a charitable interpretation. The pause before answering becomes thoughtfulness. The deflection becomes modesty. The coldness after you said no becomes stress, tiredness, something unrelated. You build a defense for them inside your own head, using your own cognitive resources, and they never have to say a word. And then, when it's over, you replay the tape, and the signs are everywhere, and you feel foolish. You shouldn't. What you were doing, assuming good faith, extending generosity, refusing to treat intimacy as a threat assessment, is not naive. It's human. The problem isn't that you trusted. The problem is that you didn't have a reliable way to distinguish trustworthiness from the performance of it. That's what this is about. Not suspicion. Precision. The architecture of real trust. If most of what masquerades as closeness is actually positioning, and a significant amount of it is, then what does the real thing look like? It's quieter. That's the first thing. People who are genuinely trustworthy don't announce it. They don't have a speech prepared about their loyalty. They demonstrate it in small, inconvenient moments. The conversation they have in your defense when you're not in the room. The time they chose honesty over comfort when lying would have been easier. The way they behave toward you when they want something versus when they don't. They take sides. Not because they're tribal or unreflective, but because they understand that some things are clear, and pretending otherwise to preserve social comfort is a form of cowardice dressed up as nuance. They don't rush you. They're not in a hurry to extract or to bond or to establish depth before depth has actually developed. They're comfortable with the pace of reality because they're not managing an agenda. And crucially, they can receive a no. This is perhaps the most reliable single test of someone's intentions toward you. Not the dramatic no, not the refusal of something enormous, but the casual, small, no explanation required, no. I can't make it tonight. I'd rather not talk about that. I need some space this week. How does someone respond to the version of you that isn't giving them what they want? That response, not the warmth during the easy times, not the grand gestures when something is at stake, is the person. What Machiavelli was actually saying. He has been misread for 500 years, which is perhaps the most human thing that could happen to a thinker who spent his career watching humans misread everything. People think he was prescribing manipulation. He was describing it. People think his worldview is dark. It's clear-eyed, which looks dark if you've been squinting. People think he was arguing that virtue doesn't matter. He was arguing that virtue without strategic intelligence is a gift to people who have neither. The sentence that matters most, the one that gets quoted least, is this: a prince who is deceived gets what he deserves. Not cruel, not cold. True. If you walk into a negotiation assuming the other party shares your values, and they don't, the resulting disaster is not entirely their fault. They acted according to their nature. You acted according to a fantasy about their nature. The distance between those two things is where you got hurt. This is not an argument for treating everyone as an enemy. That's paranoia, and paranoia has its own costs. It isolates you. It distorts your perception. It makes you dangerous to people who genuinely mean you well. The goal is not maximum suspicion. The goal is calibration. To see people as they are, neither better nor worse, and to allocate trust in proportion to evidence rather than hope. The practice. This is not a philosophy to believe in. It's a practice to run. It starts with slowing down. The initial warmth of a new connection is real, but it is not information about the other person. It is information about chemistry, about your own loneliness, or openness, or hunger for connection. It tells you something about yourself. It tells you almost nothing about them. Give time its role. Let patterns accumulate. Notice whether behavior is consistent across contexts, whether the person who is generous with you is also generous with people who can't repay them, whether the person who says they hate dishonesty also tells small, convenient lies. Whether their private behavior and their public behavior share the same skeleton. Watch for what they do with silence. People who are comfortable with silence are generally more trustworthy than people who need to fill it. The compulsive talker is frequently managing anxiety, and what they say is shaped by that anxiety rather than by any particular commitment to accuracy. The person who can sit quietly with you and not need to perform is operating from a different place. Watch for what they do when you cost them something. This is the hardest test to engineer and the most revealing one. It doesn't have to be dramatic. You can see it in small transactions. They wanted something, you didn't give it to them, and then, how did the quality of the relationship shift? By how much? For how long? Did they work to understand your perspective, or did they pull away until you realigned with what they needed? And then, the part most people skip, apply all of this to yourself. Are you using vulnerability as a tool? Deploying confession strategically to fast-forward intimacy, to create obligation, to make yourself harder to leave? Are you performing neutrality in situations that call for you to take a clear position? Because taking the position has a cost, and neutrality is free? Are you narrating your own virtue louder than you demonstrate it? Machiavelli once wrote that the most dangerous thing a man can be is self-deceived, not deceived by others, by himself. Because deceptions from outside can be investigated, tested, eventually discovered. The stories we tell ourselves have no external check. They run unchallenged, and they shape everything. On departure. When you finally recognize that someone is not who they seemed, not because of a dramatic betrayal, but because you've accumulated enough data and the pattern is now unmistakable, there is a temptation to make an announcement, to have the confrontation, to let them know what you know. Resist this almost entirely. The confrontation is for you. It provides a feeling of resolution, of power, of having said the true thing out loud. But it also warns them. It gives them information about your perception and your limits. It transforms a quiet advantage into a noisy display. Amateurs announce departures. Professionals simply become unavailable. You don't block. You don't argue. You don't send the message you wrote at 2 in the morning. You reduce energy incrementally. You become slightly harder to reach. You respond with warmth, but offer less. You create mild distance without drama, and you let the relationship find its own level, which is usually a much lower one than the one they were trying to maintain. This is not about revenge. Revenge is a transaction where you trade your future attention for a past score that almost never returns value. This is about ecology, clearing the environment of what's consuming resources that could go elsewhere. The table of 12 where 6 people have knives is not a dinner party. It is an exposure. Get up, leave quietly, and build a smaller table. What remains? The world does not reward naivety, but this is not the same as saying the world rewards cynicism. It doesn't. Cynics are exhausted by their own suspicion. They're correct about danger and wrong about everything else, which is its own kind of blindness. What the world rewards, what the world has always rewarded, is perception. The ability to see things as they are, not as you fear they are, not as you wish they were. To look at a person and understand what actually moves them, what they actually fear, what they actually value in practice rather than in declaration. People who can do this, really do it consistently, without the distorting fog of their own needs and fantasies, are harder to manipulate, not because they're defended, but because they're clear. Manipulation requires a gap between how someone sees the world and how the world actually is. Close that gap, and the leverage disappears. This is what Machiavelli was offering. not a manual for power games, not permission to treat people as objects, a discipline of seeing, the willingness to look at an uncomfortable reality and stay with it long enough to understand it. He lived in a city where survival required this, where one misreading of a face across a negotiating table could cost you everything. You don't live in Mediterranean Florence, but you live in a world where trust is currency, and there are people who understand this better than you do, who've been trading in it since before you knew the market existed. Learn the language, not to become fluent in betrayal, to recognize it early enough to walk away clean. The difference between paranoia and perception is this. Paranoia sees threats that aren't there. Perception sees the ones that are. One of them keeps you safe. The other just keeps you alone. The practice is in knowing the difference and having the patience to wait until you do.